Hey guys, what's up? It is Public back with another video, and today we're going to be talking about dungeons, and specifically, how does it feel right now to play Shadow Priest in dungeons in Shadowlands, right? I've talked about raiding, I've talked about Torghast, and basically everything else about how Shadow works right now, but dungeons is the one thing I've been holding off for, and part of that's because I have pretty mixed feelings about this. They've done some weird things to the spec that have just really weird consequences inside Mythic Plus and just a dungeon environment in general, so I've tested every dungeon at least a few times on beta and also alpha, and so now that I have a bit more thoughtful opinions about stuff, so I'm here to share those today. So we're going to go over, one, how does it play, what are the problems with it, how it works right now, how do the Coven abilities play into all of this and how they help my decision making here, what do the Legendaries feel like, how do our talents feel. And, you know, I think throughout this video, you'll notice a lot of similarities to what I was calling out in the raid video. So if you haven't checked that out, highly suggest you do that. We did some raid testing earlier, and there's a lot of similarities into the problems with what priests are currently facing. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about in this video is just in general how it plays. And honestly, the only real thing to talk about here is Void Form and Devouring Plague. So I've already mentioned a lot of the problems that we currently have with Devouring Plague from like a rating perspective, and basically everything that I said about that is true here, except on a much larger scale. So basically, with Devouring Plague in the game, we are very much incentivized to stop caring about Void Form, except for Void Eruption and getting access to Void Bolt to help refresh our dots a little bit. Now, what this basically means is, and you'll see this in all the footage that I'm playing in the background of this video, is that I'm basically constantly fighting with the spec itself to keep out as many Devouring Plagues as possible on as many targets as possible. And what that basically means is that, you know, if I'm in Void Form, I'm purely there just to cast Devouring Plague, right? I don't want to cast Devouring Plague out of Void Form because then it makes it harder to propel myself. I only want to do that inside of Void Form and then, you know, do that once or twice in a single Void Form, get out, and then get back in as soon as possible, right? And this is very similar to the raid build, except now we have a bit more tools at our disposal to actually make this kind of churn along. You know, mostly because there are so many different mobs in a pack, usually 4 to 5, right? Where you can, you know, Mind Seer to help you get back into Void Form faster. You can do all these kind of things to help propel you forward that we don't necessarily get in a raiding environment. So what that means is you can easily get, you know, 2, 3, 4 Devouring Plagues out in a pack at a given time if you get the right procs, if you get, you know, Power Infusion up, if Mindbender's active, all that same stuff, right? And so, you know, and the reason I've taken so long to make this video is because I'm really unsure about if I even like this to begin with, because this does solve the problem a little bit in the sense that your Void Form doesn't matter anymore, right? It doesn't matter how many stacks I get. It doesn't necessarily matter if the tank is chain pulling properly for Shadow, because honestly, I'm only in Void Form to cast Devouring Plague, so losing it is much less of a bigger deal, right? The problem is honestly just how it plays. The fact that I'm going into Void Form and then purposely dropping out and kind of doing this in between waffling thing just feels really weird and strange. And maybe it's just me, but it doesn't feel like the right thing I want to do to make Void Form more impactful, especially in a dungeon environment. Although we do kind of get there, although, you know, we're just basically replacing that Void Form chain pulling this with, well, now I need to make sure that when I cast Devouring Plague on something, I hope they live the full 12 seconds of the dot, otherwise I kind of just wasted damage, right? So it solves one problem in a very like hacky backwards way that I'm not sure was intended, but then creates a lot of new different problems, which is still, you know, we still have the problem with ramping into Void Form, right? Like Devouring Plague does not solve you choose Void Form or Devouring Plague. You're actually choosing between, do you want to push a high Void Form stack, or do you want to cast Devouring Plague at low stacks of Void Form, right? That's the choice. It doesn't exactly change our ramp a whole lot. It does make it a little shorter, but you still have the tail on the end where Devouring Plague has to finish its damage to get the full use out of it. So it's just really strange, right? And the same problem we have in raids is still true in dungeons, although I feel like I kind of encounter it a bit more often than otherwise, is that you keep getting into these moments where you're like, okay, I really want to cast Devouring Plague here. I'm around, 20, 22 stacks, something like that. But the drain is happening so quickly that no matter what I press to get me back up, I can't cast Devouring Plague unless I just kind of sit there and do nothing for a second to fall out of Void Form and then get back in. So I definitely found myself doing that a bit more on purpose here, which, I guess is the poster child for the term degenerate gameplay, in my opinion. Like, I'm really just staying their hands off the keyboard, more or less, waiting to drop out of Void Form so that I can go cast a Devouring Plague, right? That feels really weird. you can kind of get around this and be a bit more optimal and say like, okay, anytime you feel that way, just kind of redot your targets, because with our low levels of haste, even if you kept void form all the way, your dots would still fall off unless you get a lot of haste. So I usually take that opportunity to just like redot, forcefully drop out of void form because of that. Get back in as soon as possible, say like Mind Seer or Dark Void if I'm talenting into that, and then cast my Devouring Plagues, right? Safe to say it's really strange and it's weird to play with. I have super mixed feelings about it, because I wanted this playstyle to exist, right? I wanted a place to exist where it's like, okay, my void form doesn't matter. I do enough damage without void form, or maybe void form was reworked to be like a cooldown, stuff like that. But now it's just I have another dot that just works against void form and everything else my spec is designed for. And it just feels weird to play with. So that's kind of the TLDR for how it plays right now. And again, a lot of this is just exacerbated by the haste problem, right? Because I have such low haste, I have to spend so much of my time dotting a pack, and you especially feel this on like lower scaled dungeons, where it's just by the time I dot everything, even get one Devouring Plague out, things are already dying. So it's like, did I waste that Devouring Plague cast? Did I waste going into void form? Did I waste dotting the mobs? All these questions still come up, and still pretty bad to play if you don't have haste. So I don't know if they can fix the base haste problem, if just give us more haste naturally, or maybe tie that haste to void form more in some impactful way. Rework Devouring Plague. I'm not sure what it means, but right now we're in a very weird state, and it's hard to really say how this will go live, but that's how it's playing right now. Alright guys, next thing we get to talk about in this video is Covenant abilities, everybody's favorite topic right now. So I think, straight up, our Covenant abilities present us the biggest problem, I think, with the system inside of a dungeon environment. The Covenant ability that I want to pick is not the one I want to pick in raids, right? And it's not the one I probably want in open world environments either, or PvP. And this is really where you start to piece that together, right? If you watch the raid video, I kind of mentioned that for the most part, Venthyr and Nightfare were kind of the go-to choices for the most part in a raid encounter type situation, right? Sure, there are going to be some AoE fights where Necrolord or Kyrian might make sense, but again, as I mentioned before, you have to be in melee to use the Necrolord and Kyrian abilities, which kind of invalidates how good they actually are, right? Now, that being said, in a dungeon environment, it's basically quite the opposite, right? It doesn't matter a whole lot if you're in melee inside of a Mythic Plus environment, just because there's less things that are a problem there. There's not like a strategy where the range are usually like purposely being max range, although that does happen on some boss mechanics. So being in melee isn't that big of a deal. Typically healers these days, whether it be Holy Paladins or Resto Druids in feral form, are already in melee. So, there are actually more situations where I'm in melee than ranged, especially with some strategies in the previous seasons. So those problems kind of go away, and now we're left with, well, now we basically have 2 AoE Covenant abilities, and we have 2 more single target focused abilities, or, I guess Night Phase not necessarily single target, it's just, we're going to put that in the other category for now. But honestly, guys, I love playing Necrolord in Mythic Plus. It is the choice. Is the button super fun to press? No, not really, but man, it does a lot of damage, and it does a lot of healing, right? There's also a conduit that makes it last longer and do more damage and healing. Because of that, that just makes Necrolord feel like the best choice for Mythic Plus and just Mythic Dungeons in general. On top of their Covenant ability, all of their conduits and soulbinds seem to really favor Mythic Plus. There's so much stuff in there that's like, you kill a mob, you get something, you absorb a mob from the Necrolord Fleshcraft Shield, you get more benefits, and that just screams like after a Mythic Plus pack, you just get a bunch of stacks of stuff. It just feels really fun to play with, especially with the Amini Soulbind, which is the second one you get from Necrolord. I love it a lot. It's just, it's a big shame that, going Necrolord and raiding would not be the most optimal, right? Like, for sure. There's even some fights where you would be too far away from the boss to even get any value from it at all. So, super conflicted there. Moving on, I think I did a few dungeons as Kyrian. The ability is weird since you do have to be in melee again as Kyrian, and Kyrian you have to be more so in melee, so depending on how the mob is actually grouped up, you might actually miss some of your attacks. It does do a lot of damage, don't get me wrong. If you're using it on a pack, especially one that dies quickly, it's for sure going to be your top damaging ability. The problem is that it's a 3-minute cooldown, right? So it's pretty long. Now, is it as impactful as other, DPS's 3-minute cooldowns? I'm not sure. I don't think so. But, it's a 3-minute cooldown, so it's kind of hard to see the value there, right? So I think it's still a fine choice. I mean, honestly, if you're kind of thinking, I want to be a Disc Priest or a Holy Priest as like my main focus, and maybe Kyrian's really good for you. I know they have some great soul binds, but you're kind of like, oh, well, sometimes I want to play Shadow in like a dungeon environment, but I don't know how that'll be. I think you'll be okay as Kyrian being your choice for like a dungeon environment. It's not the best. Again, you do have to be right in the mob's butt, like right in melee, but it can work. It's just kind of awkward to press. The main bad thing I've said about it in the past is that it kind of makes you invalidate Void Form for a bit because it doesn't generate much insanity. Well, in a Mythic Plus environment, that doesn't really matter as much, right? Like, you're not really caring about Void Form stacks anyway. So yeah, it's actually not that big of a deal. It's just, is that something you want to play for your whole all round of gameplay? Because Kyrian for sure does worse than Necrolord in like a raiding situation, in my opinion, right? So that's Kyrian. Definitely, it's fine. It's, not the best, but it's not like Necrolord, but there it is. And then, kind of moving on, like I mentioned before, there's the Venthyr ability, which just all around just feels really weird. It's a single target ability, right? So it's never going to feel like super in place inside of a dungeon environment. Now, it can be really, like, pretty helpful and nice in like a tyrannical situation. But like, other than that, you're not going to get a whole lot of value from it. I wasn't getting a whole lot of procs from the Insanity Drain if the target like damages the shield out or whatever. Now keep in mind the conduit for this still isn't working, so that might change my mind. It does increase that duration a little bit, but again, this is a single target ability, so if you're pulling a pack of like 10, 12 mobs, you're not going to have time to even press this ability. You're not even going to press it, right? There are some use cases where it could be nice if you take the General Draven Soulbind, gives some versatility to yourself and your party members, but honestly, it's not as good as Necrolord, right? It doesn't feel as fun to play as Necrolord, not the best. All right, and then the last one that we're left with is the Night Fae. We've had a lot of conversations about this. It is, it is a little buggy, I think is what I'd say, is that currently right now the way it works, you give 5 other people in your party cooldown reduction, or sorry, not in your party, just around you in your raid. In a raiding environment, this ability sucks a lot right now because it's totally random who it goes on, right? So it could be a Fire Mage, one proc, it could be a Mistweaver the next, Prot Warrior, whatever, right? And now in a dungeon, this problem kind of goes away because it hits 5 people. You have 5 people in your party, right? It's fine. Everyone gets it every time. So that is actually much, much better. It's more controlled because in a raid, it's never guaranteed to go on yourself, right? But at least in a Mythic Plus environment, this problem goes away. It used to target pets and totems. It does not do that anymore. Who knows how or why that got fixed or how it got put in the first place. But, I think it's fine. The problem with the Night Fae ability is really going to be, its strength is going to come from what your group members are playing, right? If you're playing with a Mistweaver, they're going to get cooldown reduction on Revival. That's not that impactful, right? If you're playing with a Fire Mage getting reduction on Combust, that feels pretty good. Or maybe a Prot Warrior getting Avatar, whatever it is, right? And I think that's really what's come down to this ability of how strong it is, what are your group members playing, right? Otherwise, I feel like this is probably would be either my second or third choice, maybe tied with Kyrian, just because of that utility that you bring to the group, like getting your cooldowns back faster so you can have, a larger pull more often inside the dungeon. It is much more consistent because of that. I just don't know if I want to, commit my priest to a support priest, right? If that's what you want, if that's what your group needs, sure, cool. I think that's neat. I just don't know how big of a boon this is going to be to that group. It depends on who you play with, right? But guys, that's the Covenant abilities. Let's move on to Legendaries. All right, guys, next up is the Legendary conversation. Now, I'm going to kind of cut this short because this is almost word for word the same as it was in the raiding environment because unfortunately, none of our Legendaries really have any impact to AoE whatsoever. So we're kind of left with a few choices. Right now, we have the Tendril or Void Tendril Legendary, the Mindbender increasing one, or the Shadow or Death focused one. So let's start with the Void Tendril one. Again, you might want to craft this if you care about like very high single target damage that's random, but from a dungeon perspective, it's so inconsistent. We're not casting Mind Flay hardly at all in a dungeon environment except on single target. So this, for the most part, if you're using this in a dungeon, you're barely ever going to see a Void Tendril, right? If the Legendary got changed to be able to proc on Mind Seer as well, that would really change my opinion on how good this is. But right now, it's basically, unusable. Maybe on a tyrannical week it makes sense, but because we can't swap gear inside of a Mythic Plus environment, it doesn't really make sense, right? So moving on, the next one I want to talk about is the Shadow or Death Legendary, right? So if you're not aware, if you use Shadow or Death on an enemy, part of your dots gets consumed into extra damage, right? I think in general, this is hard to judge right now, right? Because if you use this Legendary, you definitely want to pair it with Death and Madness, the talent that competes with Shadow Crash right now. The problem is that talent is still bugged in that if I actually kill an enemy with Shadow Word Death, they don't get the debuff on them, which means they don't proc Death and Madness, which means Shadow Word Death does not reset, right? This is not as big of a deal in a raiding environment because mobs have a lot of health, but in Mythic Plus, you can easily, one-shot a mob if they're at low enough health with Shadow Word Death. Then you don't get the reset. You'll still get the bonus damage, but without getting that reset, Shadow Word Death just has such a long cooldown, it's hard to gauge the value of the Legendary. So, I really can't give my opinion on this right until I know whether or not that Shadow Word Death behavior with Death and Madness is a bug or not. No one's responded yet. If it's not, I want to do some more testing and figure out how it is, because it could be the go-to legendary here. But, right now, the Mindbender legendary is just so strong. Getting that giant cooldown reduction for Mindbender that we're kind of almost defaultly talented into now just feels too good to give up. It helps you get back into void form much quicker. You get more devouring plagues out, etc., etc. So, legendary discussion, I know I kind of trimmed this a little bit just because it's so straightforward. Mindbender legendary is the way to go. We'll see if they fix things. We're still waiting on another legendary, at least compared to what other people are getting right now. So we'll see what happens, but that's what we got. All right, guys, the last thing I want to cover in this video about dungeons, about Shadow Priest, is our talent tree. So yes, this discussion again, if you saw the raid video, almost everything here is going to be very similar, but let's dive in real quick just to go over my thoughts on things right now. So first things first, the level 15 row. Again, you're going to take Shadow Word Void all the time. The other options just don't make sense, especially if you're taking the Conduit, which procs a free Devouring Plague on a Mind Blast cast, therefore Shadow Word Void cast. You're always going to take this talent no matter what. It's set in stone. I don't know what they're going to do to fix that, but I wish it was baseline. Here we are. Next up, I want to move on to the level 30 row. This is the row where, we typically have the most choice. Do you want to pick Twisted Fate, Misery, or Dark Void, right? Right now, I've basically been taking Misery all the time. I think it makes the most sense. I don't know if it's just me, but recently the way the dungeons are laid out and the way the pulls are done really feels like they took the recent AoE target capping in mind. If you don't know, a lot of abilities, especially for melee DPS, were capped out at how many targets they hit. This is not a problem for Shadow Priest. Nothing got trimmed as far as we have. So Mind Seer still hits everything. Dark Void still puts Shadow Word Pain on everything. All that good stuff. But because of that, it feels like the dungeon layouts have changed in that it's actually kind of difficult to pull more than 5 mobs at a time because they're just so spaced out, or maybe they're just 2 packs you never want to pull together. And honestly, Dark Void gets the most value out of having consistent large waves of mobs every 30 seconds. Well, there aren't a lot of dungeons where that's even a thing, so I don't even think Dark Void makes sense. I was taking Misery for almost every dungeon that I've done. I tried Dark Void out a few times. It just felt like I was just, manually dotting the entire pack and barely having time for anything else because, let's face it, we have no haste, so it takes a while to do stuff. So I was taking Misery for everything for the most part. I don't really think Dark Void makes sense as much anymore, but who knows? Maybe there's some giant Mythic Plus pulls that might become kind of the meta, and that makes Dark Void more likable. But for right now, I think it's better to spend, if you only have 5 targets, I think Misery is the way to go here. And that's what I've been playing with. Moving on to the level 35 row. Again, I'm going to keep hampering this until it gets changed because it makes me so upset. We still have one of the longest cooldown single target interrupts in the game in our Silence. Yes, it silences mobs, but it doesn't really matter that much. There aren't that many mobs where silencing even matters. Some of them are still immune to the silence. So having a talent reduce that and still not be a fully reduced interrupt like other casters have is just, it stinks. What are you going to do? It's also a very, it's a shorter range than most casters. I think the only other caster interrupt that's, at 30 range like us is like a shaman one, but here we are. And lastly, guys, Mind Bomb still needs to stun. The fact that it doesn't really stinks. It's just annoying that it fears them or disorients them. I wish it went back to the way it was in Legion. Stun mobs again, that would be perfect, but it doesn't. So for the most part, I was either taking Last Word or Psychic Horror every dungeon. There's no reason to take Mind Bomb. So, okay, moving on to the level 40 row. Again, same thing with the raid video. Auspicious Spirits is a dead choice. It doesn't really give you anything. The damage increase is negligible. The Insanity Generation is therefore also negligible. So you're basically left with Shadow Crash or Death and Madness. Now, as I said in the raid video, Shadow Crash is only as good as the person casting it, right? So if you miss your mobs with Shadow Crash, it's terrible. If the tank is kind of all over the place and doesn't do a good job grouping mobs, Shadow Crash won't be as good there. So you're kind of left with how good you are at positioning and guessing where the tank is going, where the mobs are going, all that stuff. I feel like there was actually a reasonable amount of mobs inside the dungeons that I was testing that do kind of either leap away or kind of a pain in the butt to position. So that does make Shadow Crash a little bit less valued in my opinion, but it's still doing 6 to 10% of my damage right now. It's quite a lot. And was kind of my default choice for everything. Now, if the bug with Death and Madness that I mentioned earlier in the video, with it, not resetting properly, if you one-shot the target with Shadow or Death, if that gets fixed, Death and Madness might make more sense, but it's hard to say until that does. So for right now, Shadow Crash is our default. Moving on to level 45 row, again, same thing with the rating build. Mindbender makes the most sense here, especially with the Legendary, especially if you're also taking the Conduit. Lingering Insanity, Void Torrent just don't make any sense. They're effectively dead, right? Lingering Insanity was already kind of terrible if your tank had a hard time chain pulling, but because we're kind of invalidating Void Form anyway with Devouring Plague, we're not using anything with Lingering Insanity, so Mindbender's the way to go. It makes us get back into Void Form faster. Okay, guys, and then last but not least, the level 50 row. Again, not really a choice. Legacy of the Void just does too much damage with the 5% increase, and it makes Void Eruption actually castable. Otherwise, Void Eruption cast time is literally 10 years long, so it doesn't make any sense to not take this. If we want to cast Void Eruption, if we want that burst AoE, we kind of want it now, not in 6 seconds from now like it is baseline, right? Now, Dark Ascension could have some use. It could make sense depending on what we're doing. I haven't seen that quite yet. I think, that's just going to be kind of like where does the math say, but giving up that 5% damage increase I think is too strong. And then lastly, Surrender to Manos is just weird. I didn't see any large use cases for it personally. Not that it's not possible. And again, it's very much, is it worth that risk of dying and losing 5 seconds in a Mythic Plus run if your priority target that you casted Surrender on doesn't actually die? I don't think so. It's so much less consistent, and it's just weird to play with. So again, Legacy of the Void is our default, right? All right, so that's our talents, and that's all I have for this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. This is kind of how I feel about Shadow Priest right now in a Mythic environment, in a dungeon environment. Let's see. Hopefully we get some changes. Let me know how you feel about the Devouring Plague stuff. Like I said, I'm on the fence about it. I'm curious how you guys feel about it. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one.